This will be a video about Joshua Whitehead's novel Jonny Appleseed. And in this segment, I want to talk about the broader literary traditions that Whitehead is acknowledging from the Western tradition and also from the Indigenous tradition, and talk about how he privileges story at the end of this novel. And I'm just going to give you some context for this, that this novel is about him trying to get back to the reservation. And so in this sense, it's a novel about homecoming. And this is a very old trope in a lot of different literary traditions. In the Western tradition, it's perhaps most obvious in the Odyssey by Homer, one of the earliest texts that the Western tradition gestures back towards. The Iliad and the Odyssey are the two great epics, from Greek culture. And the Odyssey is about Odysseus's travels and his difficulties in getting back to his home to see his wife. And so I think Whitehead is playing off of that here, that this is about the son trying to get back to see his mother on the reservation. So it's this idea of homecoming in this literary tradition. So it's dressing itself up as a, epic literary text, that he is the hero of the story, and the difficulties that he has are part of this narrative structure. As I talked about elsewhere, the title of the novel, Jonny Appleseed, is based in this kind of quasi-biblical Christian hymn that people sing at Christian camp or whatever. The Lord is good to me, and so I thank the Lord. That's embedded as well in this text. And so we see the Western tradition coming out of Greek culture. We see the biblical tradition coming out of Western religious culture, But he also references the myth of Sky Woman from Indigenous culture, and it's on page 125, that he's crying. He's talking to his mother on the phone, and he's crying, and he says, "Sometimes imagine that when I shook my hair, Sky Woman fell out of it. She'd look up at me and say, 'Baby, you're home.' And I'd say, 'Mama, this is for you too.'" And so the creation myth of Sky Woman that we encountered in Thomas King's novel Back of the Turtle appears here as well as a foundational story within Indigenous culture. And so we have these multiple competing cultures. So as I've said elsewhere, this is a novel that is being informed by multiple different traditions. We get, kind of traditional Indigenous culture, we get traditional Western culture, but there's all these smatterings of popular culture as well. So it's a very contemporary text that tries to make clear all these competing confluences of cultural information to see how they might inform identity formation for our main character of Jonny Appleseed. And so central to this idea of the homecoming, in the Odyssey, it's about Odysseus going back and reclaiming his home life that he's done being a soldier in the Trojan Wars, and he's going back to see his wife Penelope. But when he gets there, there's a bunch of men competing for her hand, and so he has to kind of, chase them all off, as it were. It's a kind of different context for Whitehead in Jonny Appleseed, that it's like, it's this question of how do we recover the past, And one of the terms that comes from Greek that the Odyssey is known for is nostos, which means homecoming. And it gives us our contemporary term nostalgia in the English language. And so nostalgia is a longing for the past, a longing to go home. And so Odysseus feels this in the Odyssey. That's his whole purpose. And so does Jonny in Jonny Appleseed, that he's wondering, what's it like to go back to the reservation? I got to get home because, Roger's died and there's going to be a funeral service and so forth. So, what is it like to go home? And so in a Canadian context, now in 2020, it should make us think about Indigenous culture and what would it mean for Indigenous culture to reclaim the past. And this is part of what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015 was trying to address, that given the historical wrongs against Indigenous people, what are the possibilities in the future for trying to return home? It's impossible to get back what it once was, but what is possible, we don't know. So I just want to go back a little bit to the early 20th century. Then, at the time, in 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott, who interestingly wrote poetry, he's on a lot of Canadian poetry syllabi as one of the early Canadian poets. He was also the Minister of Indian Affairs in 1920, and he's infamous for making this quotation, and I'll just read it off my screen here. He says, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole object of this bill." So that was Duncan Campbell Scott in 1920. Okay, so he sees this as an Indian question, okay, sometimes rephrased as the Indian problem. What are we going to do about the Indian problem? Okay, and so this is a project of cultural assimilation. He's not talking about killing them. He says that there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. That is, this is assimilation, okay? And what does that look like? So the title of this novel, Jonny Appleseed, the apple, as comes up several times, obviously reference to the Bible, but the apple as a metaphor for Indigenous people, red on the outside, white on the inside, red-skinned Indian, white person inside. This is cultural assimilation. Okay, this was the purpose of the residential school, was to get the Indian out of the Indian, right? To turn them into white people. So get rid of their language, get rid of their culture, remake them as white Eurocentric subjects despite their different skin color. Okay, so this is the systematic attack on the race. Okay, and so when he says, the country ought not to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. There's a phrase that goes along with this, kill the Indian, save the man. I don't know if that was Scott who said that, but it's one that often comes up, is that we don't want Indians, but we want the men. Okay, so we actually want them as the manpower, as the labor, as the subjects, but we don't want them to be Indian. We want them to be white, Christian, whatever, subjects within Canada. So, this is, the ideas of, Canada being a white person's country. So the question for this novel, is what do we do in the face of this systemic racism? Okay, so there's this nostalgia for the past. Now, Duncan Campbell Scott wrote poetry, and it was all, about nation building in Canada and, the harshness of the land and so forth. Early in this course, we read Robert Crouch, and Robert Crouch is kind of famous. I might have mentioned it in the videos about him, that when he was growing up, he looked at a map and he saw Alberta. He grew up not far from Red Deer, actually. And he saw a map of Alberta, and none of the towns were there. And so he said, I want to write this place, And so he wrote a bunch of books about Alberta, which at the time, in the 60s or whatever, was kind of a revolutionary thing to do. Nobody had really written about Alberta. But in one of his books of poetry, interestingly called Seed Catalog, okay, and I don't know if Whitehead is punning on this, but one of Crouch's most famous poems is called The Seed Catalog, and he talks about being a farmer, growing up on a farm in Alberta, and the seed catalog would come, and he'd imagine, growing all these, vegetables, cauliflower, and he incorporates all the descriptions of these plants and crops into his poem. And so he uses this, much like Jonny Appleseed. One of the lines in the poem is, how do you grow a poet? Okay? And in some ways, Johnny's asking the question, how do you grow an Indian? Okay? So on the one hand, you have Crouch, white guy in Alberta, farming, imagining, the bounty of the land, harsh as it is, how do you grow a poet? What's it like to grow up here? Very different kind of sensibility from, say, an indigenous person at the same time as Croach. How do you grow an Indian? How do you grow an indigenous person when you're faced with something like the Indian Act and people like Duncan Campbell Scott saying we're going to assimilate them into the body politic? We don't want to grow Indians. We want to grow them out of the culture. We want to hybridize them. We want to assimilate them. We want to change them into something else. Okay, so very different kinds of political histories here for the different writers. And so, this is a fundamental question, I think, to come back to is, what is literature doing here? And a novel like Jonny Appleseed is engaging with these literary traditions, as I've mentioned in other videos, to say, what is it like to write an Indian experience for a white culture or any culture, okay? That to be an indigenous person now, okay, requires us to address this past. And so we have to go home in the sense, okay? And it's a difficult and arguably heroic journey to go back to the reservation, to revisit his past and all that trauma for both the indigenous side of things and for the white side of things, to say, yeah, we are complicit in this history because it's part of our past as well.